On behalf of the Indiana University CIBER, I welcome you, and we're very excited. This is our third annual Doing Business in and With, and today's session's focused on doing business in and with Russia and the Ukraine. We're very happy to be partnering with IU's Russian and Eastern European Institute. We know that this is a challenging area currently, but it's filled with a lot of history and hopefully lots of potential in the future. We think and we know you're going to learn quite a bit today, so thank you for joining us. And then without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Mark Trotter from IU's Russian and Eastern European Institute.
I think all of us in this room follow the news very closely, so we are very much aware that currently the present day is not the most auspicious time to be engaging in business with Russia, and although maybe prospects are a little bit better given the friendlier relations between Ukraine and our country, Ukraine as well. However, you have come here, and we at the Russian East European Institute are very pleased to see you. And I'm hoping that your presence here will speak to your forward-looking vision, your ability to conceive of a better time for Russia-American relations, a time when, in fact, doing business in Russia and Ukraine will be a much more fruitful, a much more promising venture. So I think it is with that in mind that I am certainly here at this workshop, and though, as I said, current events are rather dismal with respect to Russia and Ukraine, I sincerely believe that things will improve in that respect. It is my honor and privilege to introduce to you the keynote speaker for this workshop. Mark G. Pomar comes to us from a very distinguished career as a scholar, educator, and citizen diplomat, a career that embraces a very deep engagement with Russia that straddles both the Soviet period and the post-Soviet period. Dr. Pomar received his PhD in Slavic languages and literatures from Columbia University, after which he taught as a professor of Russian language and literature at the University of Vermont, publishing scholarship on Russian history and Russian literature. But he abandoned that very promising, successful academic career to take up a series of positions in public service. First as director of the Russian service of the Voice of America, then as executive director of the U.S. Board for International Broadcasting, and following those periods of work in the broadcasting field, as it were, he held the presidency of the International Research and Exchanges Board, commonly known as IREX, one of the oldest American exchange organizations. From IREX, Dr. Pomar went to the U.S.-Russia Foundation for Economic Advancement and the Rule of Law, an independent foundation that he served as the founding president. USRF supports university partnerships, exchange of students, scholars and experts, and training programs in entrepreneurship and law. To give you an example of just one activity, one of the many activities that the USRF organizes and sponsors, in 2015 and in 2014 as well, the USRF sponsored the visit of about a dozen teachers of economics at Russian universities across the breadth of Russia, who came to the IU Bloomington campus for a 2-week professional development visit in which they learned about new cutting-edge methods of teaching economics and gained a good deal of familiarity with the operations and workings of an American university campus, and learned very much about life in the United States in the process. That is just one of many, many different engagements that USRF has. Another that I'll mention is their work with Purdue University, which Dr. Pomar might say a little bit more as well. So please, without further ado, join me in welcoming Mark Pomar.
I would very much like to address, through the work that we've done over the past 7 years. We've only been in existence 7 years as the US-Russia Foundation. And just a very quick word of how and who we are. In the early 1990s, the United States set up investment funds called enterprise funds to invest in the economies of the former East Bloc. And there were separate funds set up for Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Russia, Baltic states, all the different areas. And this was a sizable amount, several $100 million was set aside by Congress. As a matter of fact, your senator led this particular effort. Senator Lugar was at the very, very core of creating enterprise funds. And we all feel very much indebted to him for his leadership in creating them back in the early 1990s. And the idea behind them was that the funds would invest in businesses, and if they made money, a foundation would be formed that would be in perpetuity supporting programs that had to do with economic development. Some funds did well, some funds did not so well. The most successful one was in Bulgaria, which took $30 million and turned it into $480 million. And so a country of 7-8 million people has a US-Bulgarian foundation of $400+ million. A Polish foundation did well. Others didn't do quite so well. Russia did okay. Initially, it did very poorly, and then, of course, in 2004, 2005, 2006, as the economy grew at a very rapid pace, it made up a fair amount of money. So we have an endowment of roughly $200 million that forms the US-Russia Foundation, from which we can spend money to support American-Russian activities in the area of economics. That's sort of the heart of who and what we are. So when I came to Russia in 2008 to start the foundation, the first thing we did was I spent quite a bit of time talking to stakeholders in Russia. This would be, for us, naturally, the Ministry for Economic Development, Association of Small and Medium-Sized Business, Opora, Delovaya Rossiya, those organizations that you may know, Ministry of Education, of course. And from our discussions, I had a personal meeting with the Minister of Education at that time, Mr. Fursenko. It became clear that we wanted to approach Russia in a way very different from the way other programs, USAID and other programs. We wanted to support only, and I stress, only programs where Russians were going to put in their own money. In other words, if Russian institution was going to put in money, we would match it, sometimes 1-to-1, sometimes 2-to-1, but we did not want to support any program that had no real Russian commitment to it. Which is the case, by the way, that other foundations had done, where they would come in and say, Russia needs X, Y, and Z, we will fund it. And of course, you can always find people who will jump at that opportunity. We took a very different tack. We said, if you think it's important for you and it fits our mission, we'll be happy to do it together. And so we discussed for the first couple of months, as we waited for our registration papers, what would be an important program for Russia. And word that I heard over and over and over again was innovation, innovation, small business, innovation, startups, entrepreneurship. Absolutely across the board, that is what I heard. And so we developed a program which we called Eureka, well, standing for Enhancing University Research, Enhancing University Research and Entrepreneurial Capacity. In other words, the idea that what Russian universities wanted more than anything else was to figure out how American institutions are so successful at taking innovation that happens in the laboratory and turning it into startups, business, patenting it, selling it to major corporations. Of course, they all eye Stanford, they all look at MIT, they understand that Silicon Valley and Boston, Route 128 would not exist without those universities. And Russia has, of course, great capacity in fundamental research, in science, in technology, in engineering. How does the US do it? The first thing we told them was, it's not just MIT and it's not just Stanford. It really encompasses virtually all American research universities. And that we would encourage them actually not to look at those two particular institutions, but to look at state universities in the United States. Because as a general rule, they are closer in the way they are formed. They work more closely with local government, they work more closely with communities, and they would be very excited to work with you. So we set up actually a competition both in the United States and in Russia to see which universities would emerge as sort of hubs or leaders of entrepreneurship, economic activity. We did a competition in Russia, and we wanted universities outside of Moscow. Everybody does Moscow, that's sort of overdone. And we ended up with two initial universities, one a highly technical engineering university in St. Petersburg called ITMO, which stands for sort of innovation technology, mechanics, optics. It used to be a closed university in the Soviet times, very progressive, interesting rector, very open to doing that. And they emerged as a very strong competitor. And the other one was Nizhny Novgorod, the State University in Nizhny Novgorod. We did a parallel competition in the United States through American Councils, one of the NGOs here in the United States. And UCLA, Purdue, and University of Maryland emerged as the most eager to engage with a Russian university in terms of sharing their capacity, their ability, and so, in terms of Indiana, we matched up Purdue with Nizhny Novgorod, and to this day, they still have a program that goes back in terms of how you teach entrepreneurship, how you engage students, how Discovery Park works, how you look at all the startups around Purdue that they would visit, and it created a tremendous, as a matter of fact, just the rector of Nizhny Novgorod, sort of an elderly gentleman, was initially skeptical. What am I going to learn by going to Indiana? He looked at the map, he'd never been to Indiana, he'd only been to the United States once, was in Washington, New York, and I encouraged him. I said, go to Purdue, spend a few days, and you will see a very, very dynamic campus. He did, and he came back and he said, my goal is to get at least 70% of all students at Nizhny Novgorod to go through basic entrepreneurship courses that he had seen at Purdue. They have, by the way, 55,000 students. So 70% of 55,000 is generating, not all of them are going to be entrepreneurs, but just the idea of getting them to be aware of it, to be engaged, to be understanding was remarkable. I mean, for them, it was like a whole new world had opened up. And they went on to actually get quite a bit of money from the Ministry of Education because they were able to show that they were moving toward a whole different level of international education. So what does this program entail, and there are really 6 components to this program, and I would be happy to take you through them and we could explore them further in questions and answers. At the heart of the program, what Russians wanted, what they needed, and they came to the US to do their own assessment, was education. Given the history of the Soviet Union, and given state ownership of everything. The idea of entrepreneurship, the idea of building your own business, the idea of being was something still very, very new. If it had penetrated Moscow in the provinces and the regions, it was still quite unknown. The idea was that you go to university, you do research, you hand it off to some institution. It takes the idea of actually turning it into a product was something new. So they started with all kinds of not just courses, but competitions, summer programs, how to do a pitch of your product. And I would say that from what I could observe visiting, and we in time got other universities involved. So we had 2 hub universities in Nizhny Novgorod and St. Petersburg. To that we added Perm, Tomsk, Yekaterinburg. I mean, other universities, once they saw what was going on, they wanted to join in and be part in some way or other with this new sort of approach to university education. So education, how to do a elevator speech, how to present your product in a matter of a few minutes was something unheard of, I may say, in Russia. And when they saw it, they were just taken aback. Wow, you can actually pitch your product in the time it takes to go up a few floors in an elevator. They took to it very quickly. What I found very interesting is that both Itmo and Nizhny Novgorod went out of their way to hire, in one case an American, in the other case a Brit, as their sort of leaders of entrepreneurship education, which was a very, very new thing in Russia, to hire at a university a foreigner who didn't come out of the professorial ranks, but came out of being an experienced entrepreneur. Very, very new, very unusual. They saw that at Purdue, they saw that at UCLA, they saw that at University of Maryland, and they thought this was they had not thought of actually inviting entrepreneurs from their region to actually come and work with their students. Nizhny Novgorod went so far as to get an entire building and build it modeled in their mind. If those of you know Discovery Park, they're going to have their Discovery Park, not quite as fancy, not quite as new, not quite as endowed with all the beautiful things that Purdue has, but they were set on having something like it because they realized that that is part of how you build a modern university, how you develop an innovative economy. It sort of culminated in a program we had in May of last year, less than a year ago, at Bauman Technological University, or Technical University, which is the oldest Russian engineering university going back to 1835. And the rector of that university hosted about 20 Russian universities, another 5 or 6 from the United States, a couple from Europe, Israel, Asia, to really look at how to build an innovative economy by working with students and labs. We thought it was a high point in this particular program. So education, education, education. I think that open-ended, that's probably the way to build an innovative economy. But obviously that's not enough. So we sort of look at other elements that go into the program that we thought was very important. One of the things that struck them when they came to American universities is the fact that a university, modern entrepreneurial university, serves as kind of a hub for information on businesses. If you want to start a business, you want to develop a business, universities are not a bad place to look. In particular, what struck them was the innovation corridor that University of Maryland has built. Some of you may be familiar with it, but they have a platform, as they would say, or a building where small companies come from around the world, from China, from Africa, from Middle East, to spend some time learning how to get their company registered in the United States, or how to develop, or how to find investors, how to team up maybe with an American. Or in the case of Russians, very interesting point, they came and they wanted to come to find out whether or not they actually had a unique product, because it was very hard in Russia to find out whether what you were coming up with actually existed elsewhere, the information gap being so great. American universities were a great place to find out whether or not you were competitive, whether or not what you were proposing was being done by someone else at a much better price. And so the idea of a university serving as a hub of information on economic development was something that Russians learned here and very much wanted to take and develop themselves. And this brought them into contact with their local government, which of course welcomed that very much, and private business, which in a sense said this is great to be able to have a place, a gathering place where we can bring the different elements of government, business, and university. In a sense, what we're sitting here. I mean, you've got people from government, you've got people from business, you've got people from the university. It's so natural in the US context, so utterly unheard of in a Russian context, where Russian universities just never dealt with them. They did research and that was it, and it stopped at that point. And seeing how fluid that is in the United States was just an opening, and they began to slowly realize why universities in the United States have been so successful at developing innovation. And it started answering the questions as to why MIT and Stanford are so well known, but obviously it expands far more than just those two universities. The other point, so that was point number 2, is sort of information, education, information. Point number 3 that we really stressed very much was mentoring, that it's not enough to go through an entrepreneurial course, it's not enough to gather a lot of information. If you're going to be innovative and successful, you really need to have mentoring from people who actually are in business, who are actually running a company, who will share with you how you go about what happens when you're not succeeding. How do you right the situation? Again, something done very well in the US, something quite new, if not unheard of in Russia. And that also took off very well. And the St. Petersburg University that we worked with started inviting entrepreneurs from the St. Petersburg region to come and meet with their students, coach them if they had a small company, whatever they were developing. And we thought that this would be, again, a way of bringing the university and the business community far closer together. The fourth point that we stressed very much is sort of investment. Russia had recently, a law was passed that sort of allowed the university to have part ownership of small companies that would start. Not maybe perfectly done. Russians told me that the law had a lot of problems with it, but it was something very new and something very unusual, that a university could become a financial partner in a startup, and that faculty could own part of that through a patent. And again, the US experience for them was a very, very vivid one when they visited, let's say UCLA, and they saw companies on campus where the University of California system invested millions of dollars in companies coming out of their own research labs. Now, Russian universities didn't have anywhere near the capacity to invest, but they did have some. And I found it very heartening that Yekaterinburg, which by the way is a city I would very much recommend if you're going to look at Russia. It's a very interesting, very innovative, very independent sort of minded city and university and business community. Matter of fact, Yekaterinburg people would tell me, we make the money, Moscow spends it. So they have a sense that we're the real sort of heartland of the country that's doing things rather than just spending. The business community gathered together and created sort of angel funds that they would invest in promising startups. Again, something very, very new. There was, maybe with the fall of the ruble, that there's a lot less money. But I'm talking about 2010, 2011, when the ruble was quite strong. There was a fair amount of money and a desire to invest in various companies that could develop. Again, the university became sort of a core for that kind of investment. And we encouraged it by really giving them examples around the United States of what, and whenever we could, encouraging Americans to go and spend some time in Russia and show them what they were doing. But for the most part, Russians were interested, they came, they spent their own money on this. This was something that they saw down the line, maybe not today, not tomorrow, but down the line, this would be something that they would need to develop. Another point that struck them as very interesting, and it feeds into what I've been saying, is sort of the university as a networking focus, where you set up a tech transfer office. By the way, something very new in Russia. Most universities, if they had a tech transfer office, it was empty and nothing ever happened. The idea of actually having a tech transfer office that works directly with your scientists and with the business community was, again, something that they learned and they saw for the first time, and they took very much to it. And the idea of networking, like pretty much what we're doing today, or networking on a broader scale where you have business and universities coming together. And this kind of caught on with the Ministry of Education. As a matter of fact, yearly there are various networking events that the Russian, principally the Ministry of Education, Ministry for Economic Development, co-sponsor with universities, sometimes called InnoBusiness, Innovation Business, St. Petersburg, Moscow, Yekaterinburg, where not only is this within Russia, but it's very much for people outside. So if you're going to be going into a region, it's an easy way to get involved. And they began to understand that this is a great way to market themselves, but also to attract investors. I'll tell you right off that, for example, the relationship between Israel and Russia is very strong because you've got a lot of emigration from Russia to Israel. But, I went to some of these events and there were Israeli companies there were Russians who wanted to work on with Israeli companies. It's a great way to do that kind of broad networking. And the university setting is a very, very convenient place to do it. And finally, the sixth sort of goal of our program was to encourage joint U.S.-Russian company startups. And I can't say that a lot of them have been formed. This is more maybe prospective rather than anything that's happened. But there have been several companies, little companies that formed between the St. Petersburg and the UCLA relationship. Curiously, in the area, as you would expect, in the area of theater, innovation in theater, use of techniques, UCLA, you've got Hollywood next door, you've got all kinds of things, and St. Petersburg is a major theater center in Russia. And I was very happy, I don't know the details of it, but I was very happy to learn that there was a little company that started up with some students in St. Petersburg working with UCLA that turned one of the Russian theaters, famous theaters in St. Petersburg, into something super innovative. They were able to use technology in ways that had never been used before. And this is the kind of thing that for our foundation is also core to our mission, because stimulating that kind of cooperation is both exciting, but it also builds a relationship between Russia and the United States that long term is very good for both countries. So this is sort of in a nutshell how we approached sort of the area of innovation, where I think the U.S. has a lot to offer in terms of example, where Russians are eager to learn. I mean, I'm not telling you anything that you wouldn't know. There is a lot of anti-Americanism in Russia. If you watch Russian news, which I did for 7 years, it's mind-numbingly repetitive in terms of the U.S. is at fault for everything in the world. If Turkey shoots down a Russian plane, it's the U.S. fault, and so on and so on and so on. But what's interesting is that outside of this, in this particular area, when it comes to understanding how business works, how economics develop, the fascination and interest with the United States goes into a completely different realm. I mean, it's like, this is what we don't necessarily want a lot of things from the U.S., but this is something that is very, very important and something that they desperately want and are eager to have. I have emails from rectors and from development, innovation vice rectors in Russia who are looking for opportunities, very often on their own nickel, not necessarily looking to us for money, They seem to have decent budgets, but they're looking for those contacts that they would need to develop. So what are the problems with all this? Well, it's obvious to all of you that the business climate in Russia is not great. You all know about corruption and lack of rule of law and protection of copyright. So there's a number of issues that constantly companies run into. And frankly, a lot of the more successful Russian startups want to register outside of Russia, want to move their operations outside of Russia. So for all the positive enthusiasm that I saw, when push comes to shove, there's still a lot of skepticism as to what can happen in today's Russia. There is anti-Americanism, which unfortunately is quite prevalent, probably will continue for quite a while, and that also has a dampening effect. But I would say one of the interesting problems that we saw, and one that I think surprised me, but I think it in retrospect is probably the most important, is unrealistic expectations. That when Russian universities came and they saw Purdue, or they saw UCLA, or they saw whatever other university they happened to go to, there was a sense, totally unrealistic, that we can have this too in a matter of a couple of years, without realizing that all of this took years and years and years to develop, and contacts, and you have to have an ecosystem that encourages that, supports that. You have to have money that will flow to it. You have to have government supporting it in its own way, business environment supporting, and that this whole notion of by the way, very popular word in Russia now, ecosystem, entrepreneurial ecosystem. Oh, they love it. But it was a shock to them because they thought, well, we just learn. As a matter of fact, I'll tell you, the first trip that Itmo from St. Petersburg took to UCLA, and it was a certain amount of swagger and arrogance. They said, oh, we know exactly what we need here. 2-3 weeks, we'll learn what you do. We'll copy they wanted all the documents on their tech transfer. We'll translate that into Russian. No sweat, we're going to do this. We're going to have the same system. And they realized that that's just not going to happen. Now, they've made a lot of progress. They've done very good work. They've made tremendous steps forward. I think their rector is astounding sort of educator, whose vision for the university is wonderful, but it's going to take them decades. And in some ways, they're fighting against tendencies of state domination and state corporations, and small and medium-sized businesses are being squeezed. So they are fighting an uphill battle, and they're seeing in the United States where the whole ecosystem is encouraging them in a way that develops it. So I think, many of you may have followed the issue with Skolkovo, the MIT. Skolkovo was a sort of a brainchild of Medvedev when he was president for that short period of time, where they would build an MIT outside of Moscow, right outside of the city, and they would have another MIT. They spent hundreds of millions of dollars doing it. They built, well, a couple of buildings got built. They paid MIT a tremendous amount of money to come and teach them the very things that I've just been describing. And at the end of the day, they don't have anything. They have a field, they have 2 buildings, they have a couple of students. They've got rid of the MIT professor who was their president. Again, sort of an anti-Americanism that creeps in every so often. And they really ended up without an MIT. For the simple reason that you can't artificially create an MIT just because you like it, just because you have money. It takes a whole nurturing structure to it. And it happened over decades and decades and decades. So I think the unrealistic expectation is very much at the core of what Russia is facing. So what would I do to sort of summarize kind of the main points? One, I think despite the difficult political situation, I think Russia is going to continue very much in this direction. People are dedicated. They understand that unless Russia develops entrepreneurial education, they will be a third world country. There's no question. They're just going to be an exporter of raw materials. That the world is moving toward high tech, it's moving toward a global economy, and they understand that they have to do it. They have to have an economy that's creating some products that you want to buy. I mean, the cliche is, what product from Russia have you ever bought? Chances are you haven't bought anything. If you go to a Russian store, 90% of everything is imported. Yes, they sell oil, they sell gas, they sell timber, gold, platinum, titanium, but there isn't a product that you would go to a store and buy that's made in Russia, I would wager. And so, in some ways, that's their big challenge. And they understand that the only way they can get to that is through sort of an entrepreneurial university working hand in hand with local government, with the business community, with investors, and so forth. So that's number one challenge. It's not going to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen probably in 5 years, but they understand that they need to do it, and at the same time, the powers that be are conspiring very much to make it very difficult for them. So what do they have? They have highly, highly gifted people, students, university tradition, science education. The St. Petersburg University that we worked with, ITMO, has on its plaques of all the competitions they won for IT all over the world. They have graduates who are among the leading scientists in the world. As a matter of fact, there's an association of ITMO graduates in the United States. There are enough who have emigrated to form their own little association. And some of them are working for NASA, some of them are top professors at American universities. So you have you have the pool of people who can do it. And that's probably, to start with, they're eager to absorb things, they're young, they're energetic, they are hardworking, they know what they want to do. So I think on a positive side, they have things conspiring against them, but on the positive side, you have the human capacity to learn, to do, to develop, to be. And I would say, in this case, very important, there's a notion that there's a confidence, at least I saw in Russia, that we can do it. We can be at the top. We're not, it's not impossible for us to be at the very best. And I think that's absolutely necessary if you're going to succeed. I guess the real crunch will be, and it's going to be interesting to watch, is in which direction Russia's going to go. Is it going to go more open? Is it going to go more closed? The last couple of years has been a steady closing of the country, more isolation, more sort of xenophobia, distrust of foreigners, difficulty with visas. I mean, I'll just give you a small example, but it's one that's very telling. About a year ago, we had a major workshop, as I mentioned, at Bauman Technological University. And we had a very experienced trainer, actually former entrepreneur who from University of Maryland, who had been to Russia many times, who actually knew Russian fairly well, had lived in Russia in the 90s, and participated in our program in Moscow. He then went on to Nizhny Novgorod, city 200 miles, 300 miles away, to participate in a similar program. I went to Nizhny to that conference, and I'm sitting in the room, and I see on the schedule that Scott has to speak in about an hour, and he's nowhere around. So I turned to the host of the university, and I said, where's Scott? He's got to speak in about an hour. And they said, oh, he's in jail. I said, what do you mean he's in jail? Well, it turns out that when he landed in Nizhny Novgorod, in the morning there was a knock on the door, and the police were there and the immigration authorities, and they claimed that he had come with the wrong visa. And so based on he had a business visa, but he had the wrong business visa. He didn't have the business visa that you need in order to be able to speak in Nizhny Novgorod at a conference that requires a certain blah, 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 blah. And even though he had an invitation from the Ministry of Education of the Nizhny Novgorod region, they took him to court hearing, and they sentenced him to 17 days in jail. And then the Russian news made a whole story out of it that, American, and they said he was a friend of Clinton, which is really funny because they flashed a picture of him with President Clinton from the 90s, not realizing that every president loves to have a picture taken with potential voters. It doesn't really mean much of anything. But the point is that it was so blatantly, an anti-American that of course, the message loud and clear was, and this happened to a number of Americans who are, especially outside of Moscow, who are fined or jailed for having wrong visas. That just happened a few days ago, I read, actually, again, with some British or Norwegian lecturers were thrown. So you have, dampening effect, obviously, until you have sort of Russia working against itself. So you have part of the establishment, call it the sort of liberal establishment, that clearly sees the direction it needs to go. And you have another growing, call it xenophobic, call it highly conservative, call it nationalistic, whatever, that sees all of this as very dangerous, that all of this contact with the West is not right. It brings in alien values. In addition to our program with Purdue on universities, we also had a wonderful summer program that we did at Purdue for young entrepreneurs, for university students who came and spent a month in West Lafayette going through a program on how to build a business. And we did this for 6 years. And the last year, just past summer, they were held at the airport and barely got out until calls were made as to whether these young people should go to an evil place like Purdue and actually participate in the program, even though for 6 years everything had been going perfectly fine. And we had a Russian partner, the Gaidar Foundation, that had done it just in the past year. And when they came back, a number of them were called in and questioned by the FSB. What did Purdue do to you? Did anything happen to you? Did they brainwash you? And they said, well, no, we just had a normal program. But that is happening. And I think if that continues, then of course that's a sign that things are going to get very, very difficult. So on that happy note, happy to stop and answer any questions that you may have. Yes, sir.
I think you sort of alluded to it, but we were talking about it, and you may mention about it in your remarks, this tension between innovation and freedom and the political realities of doing business in Russia today. As how can you have, on the one hand, the discussion of we want an innovative economy, but then you don't have the political infrastructure that supports any kind of freedom. And, maybe in a microcosm, but it's not a cultural phenomenon.
You have actually, as I said, you have cross purposes. I mean, you have part of the country moving in one direction, the other part going right against it and knocking it back. And that's happening all the time. And unfortunately, more and more, the powers that are preventing it are gaining strength, where the powers that wanted to move it forward. There's nowadays kind of sounds funny, but there was a statement put out, or policy put out by Medvedev his first year, called Russia vперед, Russia going forward. It's not going forward. I mean, whatever else is doing, forward it's not moving. And what he put out in that is just not happening today at all. I mean, you just look at the points that, Moscow wanted to be a financial capital. Well, that's totally out of, no financial capital, no foreigners coming, visas are going to be more difficult. I mean, there's an inward movement, and I think for the universities that we've worked with, it's a very, very sad time. I mean, that part of Russia, they feel horribly sort of disillusioned, frustrated, feeling that they're going in the right direction, and they are not only not being necessarily encouraged, but they're being in many ways kind of stifled. Yes, sir.
Would you describe this as somewhat of a retrenchment to somewhat of the Soviet days, in a sense, where there is a sense of I guess a return to the Soviet Union in its later stages, right? What's going on right now? Would you say that's an accurate description? Because first and foremost, I mean, you have a former KGB lieutenant colonel running things. We don't change that much that late in life, and.
If I could just off the topic of innovation, sort of more my academic hat, but I would say Russia is a curious, to my mind, combination of imperial or neo-imperial ideology combined with day-to-day Soviet practice. I mean, communism is kind of gone. Nobody wants to go back to communism. But there's this kind of curious, they've created this fantastical Tsarist legacy that is somehow, the role of the church and the grandeur of the country and our values. And the Minister of Culture, Mr. Medinsky, writes, Russia's not Europe. It's a separate civilization. It's not like the decadent West. So you have that. And then on a day-to-day basis, you just have a lot of default, what I would call petty Soviet ways of doing things. Control, visa, stamps. Now, I was telling Mark on the way up here from Bloomington that it's a funny story, but it's part of it. I went to a conference at the Ministry of Education with one of my Russian board members, and instead of being escorted to the right room, since he was a Russian, we just walked down the hall, and all of a sudden I was surrounded by a group of aides to the Minister of Education saying, but you can't be here. You're an American. This hallway is not for Americans. You can't be here. And to them it was like something horrible had happened, even though it was just a plank with all the doors closed. But that's Soviet behavior, that a foreigner cannot walk down this hallway, a foreigner has to walk down that hallway, because that's the regulation and rule. Foreigners can't be in this part of the building, for whatever reason. I mean, that actually is much more typical of the last 2 or 3 years, not at all 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. I mean, 5, 6, 7 years ago, people didn't pay attention. Now these little rules are coming back. I'll give you another example, maybe more telling. 2008, 2009, 2010, I could call someone at a ministry, not necessarily minister or deputy minister, but somebody who was in charge of innovation, let's say, and say, Dima, Vaisa, whatever, let's go have a cup of coffee and talk about it. No problem, let's meet at Chokoladnitsa, we'll have. Starting 2012, no Russian official will meet with an American like that. You have to write a letter. You have to explain why you need to meet with them. They will then set a date in a specific room. In that room, there will be 1 or 2 minders who take notes, who never introduce themselves, never shake your hand, just sit in the corner and they take notes. There you have it. It did not happen in 2010. It most certainly happens in 2012. I've had people in the ministry tell me, look, we're friends, we know each other, I can't write to you, I really shouldn't call you, and we probably shouldn't be seen one-on-one. Well, I'll meet you in a big room, but I won't meet you one-on-one. So that has come back. Fear. People are very fearful, very careful as to, and of course, and then there are others, younger people, who just sort of say, I don't care, I can, but no, that's true. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Pomar. I'm Dr. Toby Malachi, founder and global chief executive of Malachi Group Worldwide. And I agree with your premise. It's an interesting approach, innovation through the Russian economy, through the SME, small business, starting small businesses. I find it very interesting and fascinating that I, for one, thought that Russia was a little bit further down the line in terms of small business innovation and growth. I see that they're not necessarily are. And I always said that the new international currency, making connections, wine. I was telling Olga and her brother, so is Russian caviar, which is very well good as well. But the challenge is becoming that the younger Russian business SMEs are more interested in meeting U.S. SMEs, and the dialogue seems to be more open. But as Olga was saying, I think that there seems to be some doors closing going back to my first international Russia back in 1973. I was with General Motors Corporation. How does one, those of us that are SMEs, how do we overcome that, knowing that, as you say, sir, the new direction of Russia is maybe a little more isolationist, and then we also have presidential candidates who are talking isolationist.
Mm-hmm. Which is a very, very dangerous way to go, because one encourages the other. I mean, I can only say that there are plenty of people in Russia who would want an open, engagement. There are, as I mentioned earlier, there's an association of small and medium-sized businesses that has a program to go outside of Russia and to do international. It's just that for political reasons, they feel more comfortable going to Asia or to Israel. Not necessarily, and certainly not the United States. which is enemy number one. Europe depends on where in Europe. But next week I will be in Israel, actually, because one of our partners very much wants to work with Technion and University of Tel Aviv. And there's an understanding, first of all, Russians don't need visas to Israel. So there's just the ease with which you can go back and forth. Nor do Israelis need visas to go to Russia. So, and plus the Israelis are all former Russian or former Soviet citizens. So you've got this kind of language understanding, no visa, no problem going back and forth. And you have an entrepreneurial culture, startups, and environment that is very dynamic and more understandable. So I think it's not so much that Russians aren't going to do it, it's just that with the US, for political reasons, it's becoming hard. So that's kind of, or you do it through third countries. That's the other thing to do. Because there is but at the end of the day, they want the US experience. Because the Israelis are copying of the US experience. I mean, Technion copies MIT, University of Tel Aviv copies, I mean, so it's still the US model. It's just that you're getting it through a third country, rather than directly from the US. Anything else? Yes?
So, as you're working closely with universities, I'm wondering if you've been able to interact with a lot of students, and have you noticed any sort of like a generational gap between sort of the ideas or the direction of young people who are students who maybe were born after the Soviet Union fell versus the more entrenched generations?
If I understand your question, whether the younger generation in Russia is much more open to this?
Or just any sort of differences in generation of our entrepreneurs coming from different generations?
Yeah, well, when I came, I visited the group that was at Purdue a few summers ago, and to be very honest with you, they blended in so well I couldn't tell who came from Russia and who was a Purdue student, who came from Europe. I mean, it was just all one group of very talented young people. In terms of, still in Russia, your universities and your institutions are still pretty much led by people who grew up in the Soviet Union. They may have been relatively young, but the instincts are still there. It's very easy to recreate that. I think people coming through, I had lunch recently with the vice rector of one of the research universities in Washington, and she is, she looked very young. She's, I say, in her late 20s, and so she's already doesn't have that kind of Soviet background. She was a little kid when in the Soviet Union, if anything, and she's very open, very, very. And her goal, which is an interesting one, is to get more women into engineering schools and into business and so forth. So there's that opening. They're also very, I would say, liberally minded, very thoughtful leaders within sort of the Russian educational establishment. Not all, but there are some who are very, very open. Frankly, I know the current Minister of Education, Mr. Livanov, and I would say privately he's extremely open. He can't say a lot of things, and he gets overruled by the Kremlin. But as a person, as a scientist, as someone who led a university, who's been to the US, who very, very thoughtful, very open-minded, very interested in changing Russian, but very much limited in what he can do. Someone mentioned here, I believe, on entrepreneurship and freedom. If you talk to a lot of thoughtful Russians, they will say the best way to change and allow Russia to evolve politically is through entrepreneurship. That's going to be the key to kind of getting a more open society, a more democratic society, because inevitably people who run their own business are much more independently minded than people who work for the state.
Yeah, Mark, kind of taking up on that thought, I'm wondering if you could share with us your experience of these attempts to start entrepreneurship type activities at Russian universities. I'm particularly interested in the extent to which the Russian participants were openly discussing some of the barriers to development of entrepreneurship in Russia, namely corruption and a very weak framework of laws for the flourishing of business, or perhaps they were simply focused on the task at hand, getting things started up. Was there a sense of that people were openly acknowledging that, or was it just kind of something that they all knew about and just?
Well, the further they were away from Russia they were, the more open they were in discussing it. So sitting around in the States, it would be a very open discussion. Privately over dinner, it would be in Russia, never in a public setting, or rarely. Although I would say this is also something, I was there for 7 years, and I would say that the level of open discussion in 2009, 10, 11, far more open than today. I actually went, my one and only time in the same room with Mr. Putin. I was in the same room with him, room not much bigger than this. I sat actually about as far away from him as Mark Trotter is sitting from me. And this was a gathering of small and medium-sized businesses in 2009. He was prime minister then, not president, so it's 2009, 2010. And my board member, we had Russian board members, we had American board members, so we were a bicultural, binational board. And my board member, Mr. Borisov, was the president of Opora, and he personally invited me to come to an Opora meeting. And since I speak fluent Russian, I sort of don't need a translator. I can just sort of say, I was obviously the only foreigner there. And he said, don't make a point that you're a foreigner, but I'll just take you along. You might find it interesting. So I sat there as representatives from different parts of Russia were asking questions of Mr. Putin. And I would say I was stunned by how critical they were, by how open they were, by raising corruption issues with him. And he, it's different. This is 2010. It's a different Russia from today. And I thought he acknowledged their concerns. I would highly doubt that that would happen today. Matter of fact, I would guarantee you it wouldn't happen today. There's just the political climate is such that they wouldn't say it and he wouldn't come to their meeting. It's just, although I did go to a meeting about a year or two later with Mr. Medvedev. This is a much bigger gathering. And Medvedev is different, but he sort of agreed with him. Say, yeah, we got a lot of corruption problems. I mean, he sort of in that setting. Again, this is a non-foreign. There are no foreigners really. This is sort of a Russian setting within Russia. Yeah, people acknowledge it. I've also been to dinners. These are informal dinners with fairly high-level, people who talk openly about, well, you can't go to this region because the governor steals everything. That's discussed as normally as can be. Nobody makes any attempt to hide it. They say, well, you can go to this region, it's much better. You can go to Kazan, you can get this done. If you go to blankety blank, you're just going to get killed off. It's the way people talk. It's just it's considered normal. But again, this is in private. This is not in the press. This is not in a public setting. So,
if I could ask a follow-up question then, and this is again veering off a little off the topic of business per se, but general Russian society currently. I recall as a student living in Moscow in 1983, 1984, that it was a kind of, we all as students had it driven into our heads that when you're in Russia, okay, do not introduce your Russian friends to each other. That is, because you may place one or the other of them in jeopardy, right? You never know who you're dealing with, whatever, it will be a very uncomfortable situation. Okay? If you are the one making this friendship. I'm wondering, and also at that time, of course, Russians themselves, and not just Russia, I'm talking about Soviet citizens in general, were very circumspect in terms of how openly they would speak with each other on various sensitive topics. I think many Russian Soviet citizens just kind of had a sixth sense of what you could speak about with this person. Can you tell this kind of joke to this person or not? Can you talk about politics? Can you mention that Americans, what have you? Is it your sense that Russians themselves are becoming more circumspect in terms of their communication with each other in that way? Or are
I'll
we
give you-
still a ways
I
from
will
that?
give you a very good example.
And this is from 2009. When we started the program I just described, the Eureka, Enhancing University Research and Entrepreneurial Capacity, I knew the science and attaché at the Russian embassy in Washington, who I knew as president of IREX. We did a number of events at the Russian embassy, and I got to know him. And he retired right about the time that I went to Moscow. So he called me up and he said, look, I'm retired. I'm in Moscow. I told him about the program. He says, look, this is exactly what I'm all about. I've been doing this. I know the universities. I know the Russian universities. I know he had been to Purdue. He had been to a number of other places in his capacity at the embassy in Washington. So I, perhaps naively, said, oh, come to our meeting. I'll introduce you to our staff. You might be able to help us as a consultant. He got very excited. I brought him to my office. My staff looked at him, said, we're not going to work with him. And then my Russian board members, not American, Russian board members said, no, we're never going to talk to this guy. No way. They took one look at him. They said, no way. You either get rid of him or we're not going to be involved in this program. Whatever they knew, however they knew, whatever their perception was, it was absolutely, totally. Whereas Americans are happy to talk to anybody. And all I had was a kind of a consultant come in, give us some thought, and I had to say goodbye. I'm sorry, I can't. Potentially, nobody will work with you. It's primarily the Russians, and that was So yes, that was. I long ago learned that you let your Russian friends introduce you to other Russian friends. Much better practice. Well, thank you very much.